Elmore Junior High, at the start of a school day, in the first season of The Amazing World of Gumball, has a specific quality of light. The hallways are photographed. They are real hallways, shot in a real building somewhere in the United Kingdom, lifted out of physical space, and dropped into a frame where cartoon characters walk through them. The lockers are metal. The tile floor reflects fluorescent overheads. The ceiling, if you ever look up at it, has the slight grain of an actual ceiling, the kind a camera captures and an animator does not draw. Into that hallway walks a small blue cat, two-dimensional, vector clean, designed at a different visual register than the building he occupies. Behind him swims a goldfish with legs. The two of them stop at a locker. The locker is real. The cat and the fish are not. Everything photographed, rendered, and composited into the same frame, and the show treats this stack of incompatible images as if it were the most natural arrangement in the world. That is what early Gumball looks like. A real place, populated by drawings, and the seam between the two is not hidden. The seam is the show. Early Gumball had a kind of restraint and strangeness that the show, as it grew, slowly traded for ambition. The trade made some of the most cited episodes of the entire run possible. It also lost something specific, and what was lost is worth naming. Welcome to Cartoon. Get comfortable. This one goes deep. Let us get into it. The show premiered on May 3rd, 2011 on Cartoon Network, after years of development by Ben Bocquelet at Cartoon Network Studios Europe in London, with animation work shared across studios including Boulder Media in Dublin, Studio Soy in Germany, and Dandelion Studios. The early production model was unusual. The backgrounds were photographed locations dressed and treated for the show. The characters came from rejected pitches Bocquelet had made to advertising agencies in his earlier career. A blue cat, a goldfish, a pink rabbit, a banana, a peanut with antlers, a cloud, a ghost, a T-Rex, a balloon. The pitch document and the early character Bible read like a list of things that should not occupy the same world, and the show's response was to put them all in the same school and let the contradictions sit there unexplained. For 3 seasons, broadly, this was the operating principle: strangeness as restraint. The world contained anything, but the camera held still, and the scenes ran on conversation more often than on spectacle. By the 5th and 6th seasons, the show had become something else. The strangeness was no longer the texture. The strangeness had become the engine. Episodes pivoted on multi-medium animation switches, on metafictional collapses, on apocalyptic stakes. The peaks of that late era are real peaks. The Inquisition, which aired on June 24th, 2019, as the 44th episode of the 6th season, is one of the strongest things the show ever made. The Choices, the 27th episode of the 3rd season, sits in a similar tier and is often cited as the most emotionally direct episode in the run. The Disaster, the 26th episode of the 3rd season, broke the show open and made everything that came after possible. This essay is not a dismissal of any of that. It is an inventory. Early Gumball had specific qualities. Those qualities were traded, deliberately or otherwise, for the qualities the later seasons developed. The trade was not a cheat. The trade was a choice. And the choice has consequences worth describing slowly, scene by scene, episode by episode, until the shape of what was lost becomes visible. Begin with pacing. The first season of The Amazing World of Gumball, which ran from May 3rd, 2011 to March 13th, 2012, contains 36 11-minute segments. Watch any 5 of them in order, and a pattern emerges. Scenes are allowed to breathe. A character will say something, and the camera will hold on the other character's reaction for 2 beats, 3 beats, sometimes 4, before the next line lands. In the DVD, the second segment of the first episode, Gumball and Darwin spend a long stretch of screen time simply trying to return a damaged DVD to a video rental store, and the show is in no hurry to escalate the stakes. The escalation comes, but it comes from the texture of the world, rather than from the structural need to fill the runtime. There is a moment, early in that episode, where the two of them stand in their living room and have a conversation about responsibility. The conversation is not punctuated by a gag every 6 seconds. It is punctuated by silence. The silence is the joke. The silence is also the world. The quest, the 3rd episode of the 1st season, runs on a similar rhythm. Anace's stuffed rabbit, Daisy the donkey, is taken by Tina Rex, and the journey to retrieve it unfolds across a structure that would not have been out of place in a small live-action film. There is a sequence in a wasteland. There is a confrontation. The pacing is patient, and the show seems to trust that the audience will sit with the patience. The mystery much later in the first season, gives an entire 11 minutes to a pastiche of a noir investigation. And again, the structure is allowed its own time. Scenes go where scenes go. The show does not rush them. By the 6th season, that rhythm has changed. The episodes are still 11 minutes. The structures are denser. A scene that in the first season would have run 40 seconds now runs 15 because the show is moving toward an idea, and the idea wants to arrive. This is not a flaw. The Inquisition runs at a controlled clip because the Inquisition is doing 4 things at once. It is a satire of fan reaction, a meditation on creative freedom, a metafictional commentary on the show itself, and a structural escalation that ends with the cast trapped in a literal black void. None of that has time for a 4-beat silence. The pacing is the engine of the meaning, but the trade is real. Watch the DVD and watch the Inquisition back to back. And the difference is not just the stakes. The difference is the willingness to hold a moment. Early Gumball held moments. Late Gumball moved through them. There were exceptions in both directions. The Saint, which is sometimes cited as a quiet outlier in the late run, holds its central scene the way an early episode would. The Pony, in the second season, hurries through a sequence that would in another episode have been allowed to settle. But across the body of work, the trend is clear. The show learned to move faster, and what it gained in density, it spent in stillness. There is a specific kind of comedy that lives in stillness, and it is comedy that early Gumball was particularly good at. Consider the way Tobias is introduced. In his earliest appearances in the first season, he is a small, rainbow-haired creature with a sweatband and shorts, and his sincerity is genuine. He believes he is cool. The show does not undermine him with a cutaway gag. It lets him be sincere, and it lets the audience watch him be sincere. And the comedy emerges from the gap between his self-image and the camera's neutrality. By the 5th and 6th seasons, Tobias has been flattened into a more reactive figure, useful for a particular kind of bro-coded gag. And the original sincerity has thinned. The character is still recognizable. The patience that built him is gone. Pacing is not a quality that exists on its own. It is the carrier of every other quality the early show had. When the camera holds, the world has time to feel real. When the camera holds, the seam between the photographed background and the animated character has time to register, and the strangeness of the seam becomes part of the texture, rather than an effect to be deployed. When the show stopped holding, the seam stopped being the show. The seam became one of several techniques the show could reach for, and the techniques accumulated. Move now to the second quality, which is the visual restraint of the early seasons. The first 3 seasons of The Amazing World of Gumball had a visual language that was unusually disciplined for a children's animated show in the early 2010s. The dominant aesthetic was the photographed background, populated by 2-dimensional, vector-clean animated characters. The Wattersons themselves, drawn in a flat, slightly outlined style, walked through real rooms. Larger or smaller scenes were occasionally rendered in different ways. Penny, a peanut with antlers in her shell form, was animated with a soft, hand-drawn quality that distinguished her from the harder vector lines of the main family. Carrie, the ghost, was painted with a slightly translucent, watercolor-adjacent texture. Bobert, the robot, was rendered in 3-dimensional CGI. Alan, the balloon, was a photograph of an actual balloon. Each of these characters carried a different visual register, and the show treated those registers as fixed properties of the character, rather than as effects to be activated for emphasis. That fixedness was a discipline. It meant that when the show did pull a different aesthetic into a scene, the deployment had weight. The robot, the 7th episode of the second season, leaned into its CGI register because Bobert was the focal character. The ghost, also in the second season, drifted into Carrie's painterly register at specific moments, and the drift felt like a courtesy paid to a character whose visual language had been established and respected. The show was not switching styles for the sake of switching. The show was honoring an existing internal grammar. By the 4th season, that grammar started to expand. By the 5th and 6th seasons, the show had become a multi-medium playground. Episodes routinely contained 8, 10, 15 distinct animation styles within their 11-minute runtime. The Inquisition contains, by some counts, more than a dozen separate visual modes, including hand-drawn classical animation, claymation, glitch art, and a sustained deployment of the show's own characters reduced to sketch outlines. The Disaster, in the 3rd season, opens the door to this kind of variation by literally tearing reality apart with a remote control and treating each tier as a stylistic moment. The opening of that door is one of the most consequential creative decisions in the show's run. The trade is, again, a real trade. The expanded grammar produced episodes that could not have existed in the early seasons. The Saint, the stories, the list, all use the multi-medium language to do things that would have been impossible inside the early aesthetic. But the early aesthetic had its own gift, and the gift was the integrity of the seam. When every character had a fixed visual register, the world cohered around the principle that incompatible things could share a frame. When the visual registers became deployable, the principle softened. The seam was no longer the show. The seam was a tool. Compare a single shot from The Dress, the 27th episode of the first season, with a single shot from The List, the 34th episode of the 6th season. The Dress contains a sequence in which Gumball, disguised in a pink dress, walks through the school hallway, and the hallway is the photographed real hallway. And Gumball is the same vector cat he has always been. And the dress is a vector dress. And the sequence runs on the comedy of the disguise, being seen by characters who exist at the same visual register as he does. The visual integrity is unbroken. The List, by contrast, contains sequences in which the visual register changes mid-shot to underline a punchline, and the change is funny, but the change is also load-bearing. The early shot did not need the change. The late shot does. This is not a complaint. It is a description. The show added a tool to its kit, and the tool became central. What it traded was the discipline of doing without the tool. Early Gumball did without. Late Gumball did with. Both modes are valid. They are not the same mode. There is a smaller observation that fits inside this larger one. The photographed backgrounds of the first season were, in many cases, photographs of locations in and around London. Bockelay and his team would scout, photograph, and treat real spaces, then composite the characters into them. As the show grew, the production scaled, and the backgrounds shifted toward a more painted-over, digitally treated style that took photographic source material as a starting point and pushed it further from the photographic register. The early backgrounds had grain. They had imperfections. They looked like rooms a person had been in. The later backgrounds were cleaner, more controlled, more uniformly stylized. The shift is subtle, and it is not a flaw, but it is a shift. And it sits inside the larger pattern of trading rawness for polish. Move now to character introductions. This is where the early to late trade becomes most visible at the level of individual figures. When Penny Fitzgerald is introduced in the first season, she is a peanut with small antlers, dressed in a cheerleader uniform, voiced by Jessica McDonald with a soft, slightly hesitant cadence. Her shell is intact. The shell is, as the show eventually reveals, a defense. It is something her family has imposed on her, a constraint she has accepted, a disguise she has worn long enough to forget it is a disguise. In the first 3 seasons, the shell stays on. Penny exists as a peanut, sweet and steady, and her relationship with Gumball develops slowly. In the patient register the show was working in. The pressure, the 4th episode of the first season, sets the parameters. Gumball wants to kiss her. He cannot bring himself to do it. The episode is not about the resolution. The episode is about the inability. The Shell, the 3rd episode of the 4th season, which aired in 2015, is the moment the trade becomes literal. Penny breaks her shell. She emerges as a fluid, shape-shifting being, capable of taking on any of the forms her ancestral lineage allows. The episode is one of the strongest of the run. It is structurally bold, emotionally direct, and it gives Penny an arc that the early season version of the character could not have had. But the arc costs something. The peanut is gone. The hesitant girl with the small antlers, who existed in a fixed visual register, who carried her constraint quietly, is replaced by a character whose default state is transformation. The transformation is liberation. The fixed peanut was repression. Both readings are correct. The show chose liberation, and it chose well, and the choice cost the original character. Tobias's introduction follows a similar curve. In the first season, in episodes like The End, where the Wattersons believe the world is ending and run through Elmore in panic, Tobias appears as a small, rainbow-haired figure with sincere ambitions. He wants to be cool. He believes he is cool. He is friends with Banana Joe and with Ocho. By the 5th season, Tobias has been narrowed. He still wants to be cool. The show has more or less stopped giving him scenes that complicate the want. The original sincerity was the texture. The narrowed comic function is what remains. Carrie, introduced in the 2nd season episode The Ghost, arrives as a quiet, slightly mournful presence. She floats. She does not eat. She watches. The episode's central premise is that she possesses Darwin in order to experience physical sensation, and the resolution is gentle. By the later seasons, Carrie has become more of a goth shorthand, integrated into the school's social fabric, and the original mournful stillness has thinned. Again, the late version of the character has done things the early version could not. The Heart, in the 4th season, develops her relationship with Darwin in ways that would have been impossible at her introduction. The development came at the cost of the stillness that defined her. This is the pattern. Characters in the early seasons were introduced with a quality that was visual, oral, and behavioral, and the quality was held. Characters in the later seasons were given arcs that the early register could not have supported, and the arcs required the register to change. Both sets of choices produced strong work. The early register, once spent, did not come back. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Move now to the voice cast, because this is where the trade becomes audible in the most literal sense. Logan Grove voiced Gumball Watterson from the show's premiere in May 2011 through the end of the 4th season. Kwesi Boki voiced Darwin from the premiere through the 2nd season. Aurélie Charbonnier voiced Anais. Each of these performers was a child or adolescent when they were cast, and each of them aged out of the role at the rate that human voices age. By the time the show approached its 5th season, the original Gumball voice was no longer the voice of a 12-year-old. By the time Darwin's role required additional recording sessions in the 2nd season's production cycle, Boki's voice had begun to shift. Cartoon Network's response was to recast. Nicholas Cantu took over as Gumball starting in the 5th season. Terrell Ransom Jr. took over as Darwin in the 3rd season, and was later succeeded by Doniel T. Hansley Jr. for the latter portion of the run, as Ransom Jr. himself aged through the role. Anais's voice changed multiple times as well. Each of the new performers was capable and well cast. None of them sounded like the originals. The Logan Grove Gumball had a specific quality. It was a voice that registered every emotional shift slightly later than the script asked it to. The line would land, and Grove's reading would arrive a half beat behind it, with a kind of soft hesitation that made Gumball feel like a child who was thinking about what he was saying. The Cantu Gumball is sharper. It hits its marks more cleanly. It has an energy that drives scenes forward. The trade is again a real trade. The Cantu Gumball can carry the propulsive late season scripts. The Grove Gumball could not have carried them. But the Grove Gumball had a softness that gave the early scenes their warmth, and that softness is not in the late seasons. Boki's Darwin, similarly, had a roundness in the lower register of his voice that gave the character his calm. Darwin in the first 2 seasons is a stabilizer. He is the brother who notices that something is going wrong before Gumball does. The notice is gentle. The voice is gentle. Ransom Jr.'s Darwin retains the gentleness but adds a slight nasal brightness, and Hansley Jr.'s Darwin shifts further again. Across the 4 performances, the character is recognizably the same person. The texture of the character changes. This is the trade that no one chose. The show could have ended at the end of the 4th season with the original cast intact, and it did not, because the show had more it wanted to do. Recasting is the cost of continuing. There is no version of the show that is both the original cast show and the show that produced The Inquisition, because by the time The Inquisition was made, the original cast had aged out of their parts. The trade is structural. It is not a flaw. It is a feature of the medium, when the medium is animation voiced by children. But sit for a moment with what it means to lose a voice. The voice of Gumball in the 1st season is a specific human child, recorded in a specific room in 2010 and 2011. Asked to read lines that were sometimes too sad for him to fully understand. The slight underreading of those lines is part of why the early episodes work. A character who half understands his own situation is a more honest portrait of childhood than a character who hits every emotional beat with adult precision. The show, in its later seasons, developed scripts that required adult precision in places. Cantu provided it. The cost was the underreading. Sit also with the recasts on Anais's side. Aurélie Charbonnier's Anais had an English-French accent that was not commented on by the show, but that gave the character a specific musicality. Subsequent performers gave Anais a flatter American register. The deadpan was preserved. The musicality was not. This is one of the quietest and most consequential differences between early and late Gumball. The show sounds different, not in the way a show sounds different when its sound designers change. In the way a show sounds different when the people inside the characters are different people. Watch the first 10 episodes of the 1st season and watch the first 10 episodes of the 5th season, and the difference will sit in your ear for a long time. The trade made the late episodes possible. The late episodes are remarkable. The voices that made the early episodes are gone, and they are not coming back. And the early episodes will always have something the late episodes do not, because the early episodes have those voices. Move now to episode premises, because the change in premise structure is the change that runs underneath nearly every other change the show made. The first season of The Amazing World of Gumball is, when laid out as a list, an unusually small-scale catalog. The DVD is about returning a damaged DVD. The quest is about retrieving a stuffed rabbit. The spoon is about a relative coming to visit. The pressure is about a single attempted kiss. The painting is about Richard accidentally damaging a piece of art. The goons is about a small misunderstanding with bullies. The mystery is about an invented investigation. The refund is about returning a faulty product. The premises are domestic. They are sized to a family in a small town. They are the kind of premises that in another show would be the B-plot. And in early Gumball, they are the entire episode. Inside those small premises, the show found enormous range. The quest moves from the family living room to a wasteland that resembles a western. The mystery contains a noir parody, a slapstick chase, and a quiet kitchen scene, all inside 11 minutes. The pressure stays almost entirely in the school and ends on a single image of a kiss not happening. The smallness of the premises was the permission to play. Nothing was at stake at the level of the world, so everything could be at stake at the level of the scene. By the 5th and 6th seasons, the premises have grown. The Inquisition is about a school inspector who threatens to erase students who are deemed too weird, and the threat is treated as literal, and the climax involves the entire town defending its right to exist. The Disaster is about Rob acquiring a remote control that can rewind, fast forward, and pause reality. The Choices is about Nicole imagining the alternate lives she might have lived. These premises are not domestic. They are existential. They are sized to the show as a whole, not to a family in a small town. The scope expanded because the show had earned the scope. The early seasons built a world that the late seasons could put under existential pressure. The pressure produced peak episodes, but the trade is the trade. The pressure could not exist as a 6th season episode. There is no room in a 6th season episode for an entire 11 minutes about whether a single kiss will happen. The structural metabolism of the late show requires more. The early metabolism was content with less, and the contentment was a feature, not a bug. Compare the structure of The Spoon, an early season episode about a visiting relative, with the structure of The Stories, a late season episode that contains a sequence of nested narrative experiments. The Spoon runs on the rhythm of a single household receiving a visitor. The Stories runs on the rhythm of multiple short tales, each told in a different stylistic register, threaded together by a frame. Both are good episodes. The Spoon is built on patience. The Stories is built on density. The patience is what was traded. There is a related observation here about A-plot and B-plot weight. In the first 3 seasons, episodes frequently divided their attention between 2 threads of comparable weight. Gumball and Darwin would be doing one thing. Anais, or Nicole, or Richard would be doing another. The 2 threads would intersect, ironically or accidentally, at the climax. By the 5th and 6th seasons, the dual thread structure had given way to a more singular focus. Episodes pursued one premise to its conclusion. The pursuit was tighter and more efficient. The texture of 2 simultaneous lives running in the same house was thinner. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Move now to the school, because the school is the location that registers the trade most precisely. Elmore Junior High in the first season is, as established earlier, a real school. Or rather, it is a series of photographs of real schools, treated and composited until they read as a single building. The hallways are hallways. The classrooms are classrooms. The cafeteria has the specific institutional texture of a cafeteria a person might have eaten lunch in. Inside that physical feeling space, the show staged its early episodes. The classroom existed as a classroom. Mr. Small, the school counselor, sat in an office that looked like an office. Principal Brown ruled from a principal's office. Coach Russo ran a gym that looked like a gym. The location was a location. It was where things happened. By the later seasons, Elmore Junior High has become something else. It is still where things happen, but the where has thinned. The school is a metaphor more often than it is a location. It is a setting for the Inquisition's parable about creative freedom. It is a setting for the Choices meditation on alternate lives. It is a setting for the metafictional turn of episodes like The Stories or The Saint, where the school is less a place and more a stage for the show to think about itself. The shift is gradual, and there are exceptions in both directions. But across the body of the late work, the school as physical location has receded, and the school as metaphor has advanced. This is not a complaint. The metaphorical school made the Inquisition possible. A school that is purely a location cannot host the parable of an inspector who erases students for being weird. The parable requires the school to be more than a school. The parable also requires the show to have spent 5 years building the school as a location, so that the metaphor has a body to inhabit. The early seasons built the body. The late seasons used it, but sit with what was lost. There is a kind of comedy that requires a real feeling place. The comedy of being in a hallway. The comedy of being late for class. The comedy of a locker that will not open. Early Gumball had a deep reservoir of that comedy. Late Gumball had access to it, but reached for it less often, because the show had developed other ways to be funny. The other ways were inventive. The other ways did not require the hallway to feel like a hallway. The hallway comedy thinned. Look at the 8th episode of the second season, in which a third best friend candidate is being tested by Gumball and Darwin. The episode runs almost entirely in the school. The hallways are full. The cafeteria is full. The classroom is full. Every shot is loaded with the texture of an actual school day. The comedy emerges from that texture. The episode would not work without the school feeling like a school. By the 5th and 6th seasons, episodes set in the school often used the school as a backdrop for an idea, and the idea did the heavy lifting that the texture used to do. The trade made room for ideas. The ideas filled the room the texture had left. This is the broader pattern, and it sits at the heart of the early to late trade. The early show was a show about a place. The late show was a show about itself, in a place. The late show's selfhood was the engine of its peaks. The early show's place was the engine of its warmth. Move now to the Watterson family dynamic, which is the relational core of the show, and which underwent perhaps the most subtle of all the trades. In the first season, the Watterson family is a soft unit. Nicole is stressed, but warm. Richard is dim, but loving. Aeneas is precocious, but childlike. Gumball and Darwin are two brothers who argue and reconcile within the same scene. The household is tight. The household has problems, but the problems are problems that resolve. The painting, the 17th episode of the first season, ends with Richard and Gumball sitting together, their relationship slightly improved by the episode's events. The DVD ends with the family closer than they started. The pressure ends with Gumball not having kissed Penny, but with Darwin and Gumball walking home together, the brotherhood intact. By the 5th and 6th seasons, the household has hardened. Nicole is more controlling. Richard is more obsessed with food. Aeneas is more deadpan. Gumball is more cynical. Darwin is more anxious. The episodes that focus on the family no longer end with the household closer than it started. They end with the household having survived another episode. The survival is funny. The hardening is also visible. This is one of the most contested observations in the early to late comparison, because it is sometimes read as a complaint about character development. It is not a complaint. Characters in long-running animated shows often harden as their writers find sharper edges to push them against. The Simpsons hardened over its first 10 seasons. Family Guy hardened over its early run. The hardening is a real artistic choice, and it produces real comedy. But the early softness of the Wattersons was a specific quality, and the quality is gone, and the loss is worth naming. Compare the painting, in which Richard's accidental damage to a piece of art becomes a vehicle for father-son tenderness, with The Heart, the 15th episode of the 4th season, in which Richard's involvement in Darwin's romantic life is more abrasive, more interfering, more comic in its damage. The Heart is a strong episode. The Heart is also a different register. The early Richard would not have been written into The Heart's comic position. The late Richard is at home there. Or compare The Refund, an early episode in which Richard tries to return a sandwich, and the comedy emerges from his gentle bewilderment at the rules of consumer transactions, with The Choices, in which Nicole imagines the lives she might have lived, and the imagined lives are partly defined against the household she actually has. The Choices is one of the most beloved episodes of the run. The Choices is also a kind of episode that the early household could not have hosted, because the early household was not yet sad enough to make the alternate life premise resonate. The trade made the choices possible. The trade made the heart possible. The trade made the family the kind of family whose dynamics could carry serialized weight. The early family was a sitcom family. The late family was a drama family with sitcom skin. Both registers are valid. They are not the same register. The specific case of Richard deserves its own attention because Richard is the character whose depiction shifted most clearly across the run. In the first season, Richard is a large pink rabbit who has never held a job, who has been at home raising the children, who is dim in a particular way that registers as loving rather than as comic shorthand. He is gentle. He is patient. He is the parent who is always available. The refund, the painting, the job all give Richard scenes in which his dimness is the source of warmth rather than of damage. He is a father who does not know how the world works, and the not knowing is part of why his children love him. By the 5th and 6th seasons, Richard's dimness has been largely replaced by his food obsession. He is the character who cannot resist a sandwich. He is the character whose appetite is a recurring punchline. He is the character whose comic register has narrowed to a single trope. The narrowing is funny. The narrowing also flattens what was originally a more textured figure. The refund's Richard would not have eaten the sandwich. The late Richard would not have returned it. The shift is gradual. It is not the result of a single creative decision. It is the result of writers reaching for the easiest comic position the character could occupy, and the food obsession trope being a position that delivers reliable laughs. The trade is a trade between texture and reliability. The early Richard was textured and unpredictable. The late Richard is reliable and flat. Nicole's depiction shifted in a parallel way. In the first season, Nicole is a working mother whose stress is the dominant feature of her presentation. She holds the family together. She is the one who notices when bills are unpaid, and when groceries are missing, and when Gumball has done something irresponsible. Her stress is sympathetic. The pressure positions her as the parent who knows her son better than her son knows himself. The painting positions her as the parent who can be hurt by her family's carelessness. The early Nicole is a portrait of a particular kind of overworked maternal patience, and the portrait is detailed. By the 5th and 6th seasons, Nicole has been pushed toward a different register. She is more controlling. She is more given to bursts of intensity that border on rage. The Choices uses her interiority in ways the early seasons could not have. The Choices is also an episode in which Nicole's frustration with her actual life is the engine, and the frustration is sharper than the early stress was. The early Nicole was stressed. The late Nicole is unhappy. The shift is consequential. The shift produced peak material. The Choices is one of the strongest character pieces in the run, and it could not have been made about the early Nicole. The early Nicole was not yet the character who could imagine alternate lives in that detailed a way, because the early Nicole was still inside the life. The late Nicole was outside it enough to imagine the alternates. The outsideness is the dramatic gift. It is also the loss of the insideness that made the early scenes warm. Aeneas sits in a different position. Of all the Wattersons, Aeneas is the character whose register changed least. And the change that did happen is more a narrowing than a hardening. In the first season, Aeneas is a 4-year-old rabbit who reads above her age, who notices what her brothers miss, and who occasionally lets the 4-year-old register show. The Pony, the 7th episode of the 2nd season, is the clearest expression of this. Aeneas wants a pony. The pony she wants is a specific cartoon pony associated with a Pony Princess franchise. The episode lets her be a child wanting a child's thing, and the wanting is sincere, and the sincerity is the texture. By the 5th and 6th seasons, Aeneas is more reliably the deadpan younger sister, the source of dry observations on her brother's choices, the smart one whose smartness is the joke. The deadpan was always there. The childlike sincerity has thinned. The trade is small by comparison to the trades happening to her parents and brother, but it is part of the same pattern. Each Watterson moved toward the comic position the writers could most reliably reach. The early seasons let the comic position breathe alongside other registers. The late seasons collapsed the registers toward the position. The collapse made the show more efficient. The efficiency cost the texture. There is a household level observation that ties these individual shifts together. In the first 3 seasons, the Watterson house is a place where the family lives. Episodes show meals, mornings, evenings, the drift of family time. In the later seasons, the house is more often a stage for the comic crisis of the day. The drift of family time has been compressed. The compression is not a flaw. It is what happens when a show finds a more efficient mode and chooses to operate in it. Move now to the world building, because this is where the trade plays out at the largest visible scale. Elmore in the first season is a small town. It has a school. It has a video rental store. It has a supermarket called the Rainbow Factory. It has a park. It has a few streets and a few houses. The geography of the town is loose, but the town reads as a town. The Wattersons' house is in a residential neighborhood. Penny's house is somewhere else in the same neighborhood. The school is reachable on foot. The world is sized to the family's ability to walk through it. The first season's world building is a quiet accumulation. Episode by episode, locations are introduced. The video rental store from the DVD, the supermarket, the school, the various homes of the supporting cast. There is no sense in the early episodes that the town is meant to be more than a town. There is no metafictional hint that the world is a stage. There is no suggestion that anything outside Elmore exists in any structured way. The town is the world, and the world is small. By the 5th and 6th seasons, the world has expanded conceptually. The Disaster introduces the idea that reality itself is malleable. The Inquisition introduces the idea that an outside force can erase characters from existence. The Stories introduces the idea that the show can tell stories about itself, and the stories can comment on the medium. Episodes like The Void establish entire alternate spaces inside the world's logic, including a literal void where rejected character designs are stored. The expansion is conceptual, not geographic. The town is still small. The town's metaphysical context is enormous. The trade made the late peaks possible. The Inquisition could not work in a town that had not been given a metaphysical context. The Disaster could not work in a world where reality had not been declared malleable. Each conceptual expansion built on the last, and the cumulative effect was a show whose late episodes could perform feats that the early episodes had not yet earned the right to perform. But the cost is the smallness. The first season's Elmore is a place a person could live in. The 6th season's Elmore is a place that exists to be torn apart and reassembled. Both are valid choices. The early Elmore had a quality of intimate familiarity that depended on the town not yet being a metaphor. Once it became a metaphor, the intimacy thinned. There is a parallel observation in how the supporting cast was deployed across the seasons. In the early seasons, characters like Banana Joe, Tobias, Carrie, Sarah, Masami, and Idaho were used in small ways, often as faces in classroom scenes, or as participants in single episode plots. By the 5th and 6th seasons, the show had developed a richer ensemble dynamic, with episodes specifically focused on pairs and groupings of supporting characters. The Heart explores Carrie's relationship with Darwin in extended detail. The Triangle pairs Tobias with characters he had previously orbited rather than engaged. The deepening was a gain. The smaller scale early use of these characters was lost in the deepening. Move now to the question of Ben Bakalay's role in the show, because the production side shift is one of the underlying mechanisms of the early to late trade. Bakalay created the amazing world of Gumball and served as its showrunner from the show's premiere in May 2011 through, broadly, the 5th season. He stepped back from active showrunning duties around the end of the 5th season and the beginning of the 6th, with the production transitioning to a model in which other senior creative figures, including Mike Graves and others on the Cartoon Network Studios Europe team, took on more direct day-to-day oversight. Bakalay remained involved as a creator, but the hands-on guidance of the early seasons was, by the show's last year, distributed across a larger group. This is the kind of transition that often produces a visible shift in a show's texture, even when the shift is hard to attribute to any single decision. Showrunners are responsible for the small choices that accumulate into a show's identity. The decision to hold a moment 2 beats longer. The decision to keep a character at a single visual register. The decision to write a small premise rather than a large one. When the showrunner steps back, those small choices begin to be made by other people, and the cumulative texture begins to shift, even if every individual choice is defensible. The early seasons of Gumball were marked by Bakalay's specific sensibility, the patience of the pacing, the integrity of the seam, the quietness of the comic register at its softest moments. These were qualities he had built into the show from its earliest pitches, and they survived for as long as he was the dominant creative voice. The late seasons were marked by a more collective sensibility, and the collective sensibility produced ambitions the early sensibility had not pursued. The Inquisition is, in some readings, an episode that argues for the value of the show's strangeness in the face of pressure to normalize it. It is sometimes read as Baucale's farewell to the show, made under the conditions of his stepping back. Whether or not that reading is correct, the episode functions as a meditation on the question of what the show was for, and the meditation lands because the show by that point had earned the right to ask the question. But the trade, again, is real. The show that Baucale ran was not the show that came after. The show that came after was capable of things the earlier show could not have done. The earlier show was held together by a single sensibility, and the singleness gave the work a coherence that is harder to maintain across a larger group of decision makers. Coherence is not the only virtue. It is a virtue. Its erosion is one of the things the late seasons traded for the things they gained. There is a related observation about the production model. The early seasons of Gumball used a distributed studio system, with animation work parceled out to Boulder Media in Dublin, Studio Soy in Germany, Dandelion Studios, and others. Each studio brought its own technical strengths, and the distributed model produced a particular kind of variation in the look of the show, even within the early visual restraint. As the show grew, the production consolidated in some respects, and the technical variation thinned. The thinning is not a flaw, it is a side effect of scale, but it is part of the broader pattern of the show becoming more uniform as it became more ambitious. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Move now to the question of episode rhythm, because the rhythm of an early episode and the rhythm of a late episode are different kinds of rhythm, and the difference deserves direct comparison. The early episodes of The Amazing World of Gumball, broadly through the third season, operate on what could be called a dual-thread rhythm. The opening scene establishes a domestic situation. The second scene introduces a complication. The third scene splits the family or the friend group into parallel tracks, and the parallel tracks proceed through the middle of the episode. The climax, in many of these episodes, is the moment when the parallel tracks converge, often in a way that reveals the complication to have been mutual all along. The mystery operates this way. The DVD operates this way. The refund operates this way. The dual thread rhythm is not a hard rule. There are early episodes that pursue a single thread, but the rhythm is common enough to constitute a default mode. The late episodes, by contrast, more often pursue a single thread rhythm. The opening scene establishes a premise. The premise expands. The expansion accelerates. The climax is a culmination of the single thread rather than a convergence of two. The Inquisition follows this shape. The disaster follows this shape. The Choices, which is structured around Nicole's interior monologue, follows this shape. The single thread rhythm allows the show to drive an idea to its full expression. It also produces a different kind of viewing experience. The dual thread rhythm of the early episodes had a specific texture. It felt like a show about a household where multiple things were happening at once. Nicole was at work. Richard was at home. Gumball and Darwin were at school. Aeneas was wherever Aeneas was. The episodes that split the family into parallel tracks were, in some sense, honoring the realistic structure of family life, in which family members do not all participate in every event. The single thread rhythm of the late episodes is more efficient. It is also more like a film than like a sitcom. The shift is consequential. Compare the rhythm of The Quest, an early episode that splits the family across multiple tracks before converging in a wasteland, with the rhythm of The Inquisition, which holds a single tightening focus across its 11 minutes. Both episodes are excellent. They are excellent in different ways. The Quest is excellent because the convergence is earned by the parallel tracks. The Inquisition is excellent because the tightening is sustained by the relentlessness of the single thread. Each rhythm produces its own kind of payoff. The early seasons specialized in convergence payoffs. The late seasons specialized in tightening payoffs. There is a related observation about runtime. Both early and late episodes run 11 minutes, but the 11 minutes are used differently. Early episodes spend more of their runtime on scene setting and character behavior. Late episodes spend more of their runtime on plot escalation. The percentages are not formal, but they are visible. An early episode might give 2 minutes to a quiet domestic scene before the complication arrives. A late episode might give 30 seconds to the same kind of scene before pushing into the premise. The show learned to compress. The compression cost the room in which the early softness used to live. This is the rhythm-level expression of the broader trade. Early Gumball had room. Late Gumball had drive. The room produced a particular kind of comedy and a particular kind of warmth. The drive produced a particular kind of ambition and a particular kind of payoff. Neither room nor drive is wrong. They are different operating principles for the same medium. Move now to the animation style switches, because this is the technical question that registers most visibly to a casual viewer. The Amazing World of Gumball was, from its premiere, a show that mixed visual styles. The first season already contained the photographic backgrounds, the vector main characters, the painterly Carrie, the CGI Bobert, the photographic Alan. The mixing was the texture, but the mixing in the first season was, as discussed earlier, fixed at the character level. Each character had a register, and the register was their property. The show did not switch styles within a single character's depiction. Gumball was vector. Bobert was CGI. The boundaries held. By the 5th and 6th seasons, the boundaries had become permeable. Episodes routinely shifted style, mid-shot, mid-scene, sometimes mid-sentence. A character might be drawn in their default register for one line, and in a different register for the next. The shift was usually in service of a joke or an emotional beat, and the shifts were often funny. They were also, structurally, a different operating principle from the early visual restraint. The Inquisition is the most extreme expression of this. The episode's central conceit involves the inspector's ability to reduce characters to sketch outlines as a punishment for being too weird, and the visual register of the affected characters changes as the punishment is applied. The conceit is brilliant. It is also a conceit that depends on the show having developed the technical capacity to switch registers fluidly. The early seasons did not have that capacity, or did not deploy it, and an Inquisition-style episode was not available to them. The disaster in the 3rd season is the Threshold episode. Rob acquires a remote control that can rewind, fast forward, pause, and edit reality. The remote control's effects are visualized through animation-style switches. A rewind sequence is visualized as a literal rewinding of the animation. A pause is visualized as a freeze frame. A fast forward is visualized as accelerated motion. The episode opens the technical door that the later seasons walked through. The trade, once again, is real. The technical permeability produced episodes that would have been impossible in the early aesthetic. The Worst, The List, The Stories, The Inquisition. All of these episodes use the permeability as a primary tool. The early aesthetic had its own gift, and the gift was the discipline of letting incompatible images share a frame without the frame itself becoming a commentary on the incompatibility. When the frame became a tool, the original integrity of the seam was no longer the show's primary concern. The seam was now one of many things the show could do. This is the technical level expression of the broader trade. The early show made one kind of strangeness central and held it. The late show made many kinds of strangeness available and deployed them. The deployment produced a richer comic vocabulary. The deployment also dispersed the original strangeness across a wider set of techniques, and the original strangeness, as a concentrated quality, thinned. There is a smaller observation that fits here about the use of color. The early seasons of Gumball had a relatively muted color palette in their backgrounds because the backgrounds were photographic, and photographs of real spaces tend toward muted color. The vector characters were often more saturated than their environments, and the contrast was part of the visual identity. By the later seasons, the color palette had warmed and saturated, with more digital treatment of backgrounds bringing the environment closer to the character register. The contrast thinned. The visual identity remained, but its internal contrast was less sharp. Move now to a smaller but worth naming quality, which is the early show's use of silence. Watch any early episode and count the silences. They are everywhere. A character will react. A character will not respond. A character will look at another character, and the show will hold the look. Music in the early episodes is often understated, sometimes absent, and the absence is the point. The DVD has stretches of pure dialogue with no underscore. The quest has long sequences in the wasteland where the only sound is footsteps and wind. The pressure ends in near silence, with the camera holding on Gumball's failure to kiss. The late episodes are louder. They have more music. They have more sound design. The sound design is often excellent. The The disaster's pause and rewind sequences are scored to specifically support the temporal manipulation. The Inquisition's escalation is carried in part by an escalating score, but the silences of the early episodes are largely gone. The silences were a quality. They were also a permission, granted to the audience, to sit with what was happening on screen. When the silences thinned, the permission thinned with them. This is one of the more subjective observations in the inventory, because silence is not measurable in the way an episode count or a character introduction is measurable. But anyone who has watched the show across its run will recognize the difference. The early show was quieter. The late show was busier. Both modes have their virtues. Both modes are not the same mode. There is a related observation about the use of music itself. The early seasons of Gumball used music sparingly and often diegetically. Songs that appeared in episodes were often songs the characters were aware of. By the later seasons, the show had developed a richer musical vocabulary, including original songs, parody songs, and underscore that pushed against the previously understated approach. The Romantic, the 8th episode of the 3rd season, uses a sustained song cue in a way that was uncommon in the first 2 seasons. By the 6th season, song cues and structural musical moments were a regular tool. The tool produced strong moments. The early restraint had its own value. Move now to the early show's specific feel for its characters' minor moments. There is a kind of scene that the first 3 seasons of Gumball were unusually good at, which is the scene of a character doing something small. Gumball brushing his teeth, Darwin watering his pet plant, Aeneas reading a book at the kitchen table, Nicole opening the mail, Richard waiting for a sandwich to be done in the microwave. These small moment scenes are scattered throughout the early run, and they are not always plot relevant. They are texture. They establish that the household is a household where people exist when they are not pursuing the episode's premise. The late seasons have fewer of these scenes, not because the writers stopped thinking about texture, but because the increased structural density of the late episodes left less room for non-plot moments. The room was repurposed for the higher metabolism of the late premise. The repurposing was a reasonable choice. The texture that had lived in the room is largely absent from the late work. A specific example. In The Spoon, the 8th episode of the 1st season, there is a brief scene of Gumball and Darwin watching television together, and the scene has nothing to do with the visiting relative who is the episode's premise. The scene exists because the show wanted to establish that the brothers watch television together. The scene is 20 seconds long. It is not load-bearing in any plot sense. It is load-bearing in a textural sense. By the 6th season, 20 seconds of non-plot brother time would be unusual because the episodes have become too structurally tight to accommodate it. The accumulation of these small moments across the early seasons produced what felt like a real household. The thinning of these moments across the late seasons produced what felt like a more efficient comic engine. Both feelings are accurate descriptions of what the show was doing in each era. The early household had density at the textural level. The late household had density at the structural level. The textural density is what was traded. Move now to the question of what late Gumball gained, because the trade has 2 sides, and the gains are real. Late Gumball produced episodes that the early show could not have produced. The Inquisition, as discussed, is one of the most ambitious metafictional comedies on American children's television in its decade. The Choices is one of the most emotionally direct episodes about parental regret and adult unfulfillment that any animated comedy has produced. The Disaster is a structurally daring exploration of the medium itself. The Saint is a quiet character study. The Stories is a nested narrative experiment. The List is a structural comedy that uses the show's own visual permeability as its premise. The Worst is a self-aware meditation on the show's own quality control. Each of these episodes represents a peak that the early show had not yet reached and could not have reached without the developments the late show pursued. The Inquisition deserves specific attention. Aired on June 24th, 2019, as the 44th episode of the 6th and final season, the episode follows an inspector named Miss Simeon's superior who arrives at Elmore Junior High to evaluate the school and finds that several of its students are too strange to be permitted. The inspector begins to erase students by reducing them to sketch outlines, then by erasing the outlines themselves. The students, led by Gumball and Darwin, fight back. ultimately defending the school and its weirdness against the inspector's attempt to normalize it. The episode is widely read as a metafictional argument for the show's right to be strange, possibly in response to executive pressures the production had faced. Whether or not that reading is correct, the episode functions as a synthesis of everything the show had become. The visual permeability is at its most extreme. The metaphorical use of the school is at its most direct. The stakes are existential. The pacing is relentless. And the early show's strangeness, the very quality that the inspector wants to erase, is the thing the episode is defending. This is one of the great paradoxes of late Gumball. The episodes that argue most directly for the value of the show's original strangeness are the episodes that operate furthest from that strangeness's original mode. The Inquisition argues for the seam. The Inquisition does not look like a seam show. The Inquisition looks like a multi-medium late show. The argument and the execution operate in different registers, and the gap between them is part of why the episode resonates. The show is defending what it was while being what it has become. The Choices, the 27th episode of the 3rd season, operates in a quieter register. The episode follows Nicole through a series of hypothetical alternate lives, each one branching from a different decision she might have made at different points in her past. The structure is that of a counterfactual, and the emotional register is sustained throughout. The episode does not break for jokes in the way the early seasons would have. It commits to its meditation, and the commitment is what makes it work. The early Nicole was not yet the character who could host this meditation. The late Nicole was, because she had been hardened into the kind of figure whose interior life had become more fraught than the early household had any need for. The Disaster, the 26th episode of the 3rd season, is the threshold episode in the visual sense. Rob, a previously minor character whose one-eyed Cyclops form had been used as a background figure in earlier episodes, becomes the primary antagonist by acquiring the reality editing remote control. The episode's visual deployment of rewind, fast forward, and pause sequences was, at the time of its airing, a level of formal play the show had not previously committed to. The episode opens the technical door that the entire late run would walk through. It is also one of the strongest episodes of the whole show, because the formal play is in service of a real emotional arc, in which Rob's grievance against Gumball, who had failed to recognize him, becomes the central engine of the conflict. These 3 episodes, The Inquisition, The Choices, and The Disaster, are often cited as the high water marks of the show. They are the episodes that even the most committed early season partisan has to acknowledge as exceptional. They are also episodes that demonstrate, in their construction, the qualities that the late show had developed: the metafictional ambition, the emotional directness, the formal play. None of these qualities was central to the early show. The trade was the trade for these qualities. Other late episodes operate at a slightly lower tier, but in the same register. The Saint, the 30th episode of the 6th season, takes a quiet approach to the question of moral perfection in a flawed world, focusing on Alan, the balloon, who is so unfailingly kind that he begins to drive others into despair. The episode is a character piece that uses the show's late visual vocabulary in restrained ways, and the restraint produces something like a return to the early register, filtered through the late capacities. The Stories, in the same season, is a frame narrative episode in which the children of Elmore tell stories around a campfire, and each story is rendered in a different stylistic register. The frame device gives the show a structural excuse for the multi-medium play, and the play is wielded with control. The Worst, also in the 6th season, is a metafictional comedy about quality. The List is a structural comedy about the recurring background characters who have been used across the show's run. Each of these episodes is a strong piece of work. Each of them depends on capacities the early show did not have. The catalog of late peaks is long enough to disprove any narrative that says the show simply declined. The show did not decline. The show changed, and the change had peaks and valleys, and the peaks are real, and the valleys are also real, and the early show had qualities the late peaks did not preserve. This is the careful inventory the topic requires. It is not a competition between early and late. It is a description of 2 different modes the same show operated in, and the trade between them. Move now to the synthesis of what the trade actually was. The trade can be named finally, as a trade between texture and ambition. Early Gumball was a textural show. The texture was its primary virtue. The texture was the photographed background, the held silence, the small premise, the unnarrowed character, the soft household, the location is location school, the dual thread rhythm, the fixed visual register, the diegetic music, the small moment of brushing teeth, the slight underreading of a line by a child voice actor. The accumulation of these elements produced a show that felt unlike any other show on television. The feeling was the texture was the show. Late Gumball was an ambitious show. The ambition was its primary virtue. The ambition was the metafictional argument, the metaphorical school, the reality editing remote control, the existential stakes, the multi-medium playground, the formal experiment, the structural daring, the emotional directness of an alternate life montage. The accumulation of these elements produced a show that could perform feats almost no other animated comedy on television was performing. The feats were the ambition was the show. These two shows are the same show. They are made by overlapping creative teams. They share characters, voice actors at certain points, settings, premises that recur across the run, but they operate on different principles. The early show built a world by holding a moment. The late show used the world to push an idea. The trade is the trade between holding and pushing. Each is a virtue. They are not the same virtue. There is a tendency, in conversations about long-running animated comedies, to describe the early to late shift as a decline. The shift is sometimes a decline. In Gumball's case, it is not. The show did not get worse. The show changed. The change cost the early texture and produced the late ambition. The peaks of the late ambition are extraordinary. The texture of the early show is also extraordinary. The two extraordinariness do not cancel. They coexist as two facets of the same body of work. A viewer who comes to the show today, watching all 6 seasons in order, will experience the shift as a gradual transformation rather than as a sudden break. There is no single episode where the early show ends and the late show begins. The disaster in the 3rd season is often cited as the threshold, but the threshold is more diffuse than a single episode. The Robinson, the 2nd season's late introduction of Gumball's neighbor as a sympathetic figure, is part of the threshold. The Sweaters, in the same season, is part of it. The shift accumulates across episodes the way the early texture accumulated across moments. Both accumulations are real. Both accumulations describe a show that was constantly in motion, constantly responding to itself, constantly testing what it could do. Move now to a closer look at 3 early episodes that exemplify the texture in order to ground the abstraction. The Pressure, the 4th episode of the 1st season, runs 11 minutes and contains, by some counts, fewer than 30 distinct comic beats. By the standards of the late seasons, this is an exceptionally low density. The episode follows Gumball's attempt to muster the courage to kiss Penny, and the structure is a series of false starts. Each false start is a small scene. Each small scene is allowed to play. There is a sequence in the school hallway. There is a sequence at the lockers. There is a sequence in the cafeteria. There is a final sequence outside the school where the kiss does not happen, and the camera holds on the not happening, and the episode ends. The texture of the episode is in the room each scene is given. The hallway is allowed to feel like a hallway. The locker is allowed to feel like a locker. Penny is allowed to be a peanut, sweet and steady, who notices Gumball's hesitation and is patient with it. Gumball is allowed to be 12, bewildered by his own emotion, unable to act on what he wants. The episode does not punish him for the failure. The episode treats the failure as a real thing that has happened to a real character, and the treatment is gentle. The gentleness is the texture. A late season episode about the same premise would not be allowed to end on the not happening. The structural metabolism of the late show would require the kiss to happen, or the not happening to be made into a larger crisis, or the situation to be subjected to a metafictional commentary. The Pressure does none of these things. The Pressure simply lets the moment be what it is, and trusts the audience to register what has occurred. This trust is one of the things the early show had in abundance, and the late show, for all its other virtues, had less of. The Mystery, the 2nd segment of the 18th episode of the 1st season, runs 11 minutes and contains a parody of the noir genre, with Gumball as a hard-boiled investigator pursuing a case that is ultimately an invented one. The episode's texture is in its commitment to the parody. The school, recolored in noir grays and blacks, becomes a moody location. The supporting characters, lit and posed in noir styles, become suspects and informants. The investigation is treated as a real investigation, and the comedy emerges from the gap between the investigation's seriousness and its triviality. The episode could have, in principle, broken its own frame. It could have pulled back and had Gumball realize the investigation was invented from the start. It does not do this. It commits to the noir frame all the way through, and the commitment is what makes it funny. The early show's discipline shows in the commitment. By the late seasons, similar parody frames would more often be interrupted by metafictional commentary, and the interruption would be a different kind of joke. The mystery does not interrupt itself. The non-interruption is the texture. The refund, the 11th episode of the first season, follows Richard's attempt to return a sandwich to a fast food restaurant. The premise is genuinely small. The episode is genuinely funny. The fast food restaurant is a real feeling fast food restaurant, photographed and treated. The cashier is a recurring side character. The exchange between Richard and the cashier is allowed to develop at conversational speed. There is no escalation pressure forcing the scene to grow. The scene grows because Richard's gentle bewilderment encounters the cashier's institutional inflexibility, and the encounter generates comedy through the pure friction of the two registers. These 3 episodes, the pressure, the mystery, and the refund, are not the most cited episodes of the first season. They are not the show's calling cards. They are the texture of the early show, expressed across 3 different premises. None of them required the show to become more than what it was. All of them are excellent because of what the show was. Move now to a closer look at 3 late episodes that exemplify the ambition in order to ground the trade from the other side. The Saint, the 30th episode of the 6th season, runs 11 minutes and follows Alan, the balloon, whose unfailing kindness and moral perfection have begun to drive the people around him into despair. The episode's premise is an inversion of expectations. Goodness, in this episode, is a problem. Alan is treated not as a saintly side character, but as a figure whose virtue is, paradoxically, harming his community. The episode commits to this inversion fully. There are scenes of Alan being kind. There are scenes of his classmates suffering under the weight of the kindness. There is, ultimately, a resolution that does not undo the inversion, but instead complicates it further. The ambition of the episode is in its willingness to handle a moral question with this level of nuance. The early show was capable of moral questions, but the early show typically resolved them. The Saint declines to resolve. It allows the question to sit. The allowing is the late ambition. The technique works because the show by this point has earned the right to handle moral questions in this way. It has built the world. It has built the characters. It has earned the trust to ask harder questions. The Stories, the 33rd episode of the 6th season, is a frame narrative episode in which the children of Elmore tell stories around a campfire. Each story is rendered in a different stylistic register. The frame is the campfire. The stories themselves are the multi-medium showcase. The episode demonstrates the show's late capacity for multi-medium fluency at its most controlled. The control is what makes the episode work. The frame device gives the show a structural excuse for the play, and the play is wielded purposefully rather than scattershot. The episode is, in some ways, a late show analog to the mystery. Both episodes commit to a frame style. The mystery commits to noir. The Stories commits to a sequence of frames. The difference is that the mystery operates inside a single frame for 11 minutes, while the Stories operates across multiple frames. The early discipline allowed for one. The late capacity allowed for many. Both are valid. Both produce strong work. The Worst, the 32nd episode of the 6th season, is a metafictional comedy about the show's own quality control. The premise involves a debate among the characters about which one of them is the worst character on the show. The premise is risky. It invites self-deprecation. It invites the audience to consider the show's flaws. The episode handles the risk by treating the debate as a real conversation among real characters, with each character defending their relevance to the show. The defense is funny because it is genuine. The episode could not have been made by the early show. The early show did not yet have the self-awareness to debate its own quality. The late show had the self-awareness in abundance, and The Worst is one of the most controlled deployments of that self-awareness. The episode is funny because it is honest. The early show was honest in different ways. The late show developed this kind of honesty, and the development is part of what the trade was for. These 3 episodes, Texts, the Saint, the Stories, and the Worst are the late ambition expressed across 3 different forms. None of them is the most cited episode of the late run. They are the texture of the late show, if texture is the right word, expressed across 3 different premises. Each of them required the show to have become what it had become. None of them could have existed in the early frame. Move now to one final cluster of observations, which concern the show's overall trajectory and what it means for a show to age. The Amazing World of Gumball ran for 6 seasons, from May 2011 to June 2019, totaling roughly 240 episodes when counted at the 11-minute segment level. The show ended on a high note, with the Inquisition airing in the final stretch of the 6th season, and the List, the Saint, the Stories, and the Worst all clustered in the same final months. The ending was strong. The show did not limp out. It went out at a peak. This is unusual for animated comedies, which often run too long and decline visibly in their final seasons. Gumball's final stretch is, in some readings, its peak ambition stretch, and the show concluded before it had a chance to coast on its late capacities. The conclusion was, in part, a creative decision, and, in part, a production-side decision, driven by the larger Cartoon Network strategy. Whatever the cause, the effect was that the show ended at the height of its late mode, with the late mode having produced its most ambitious work. This is part of why the early to late comparison is worth doing carefully. The show did not decline. The show concluded. The conclusion was a peak in one mode. The texture of the early mode had been traded over the course of the run. The trade made the peak possible. The peak is what most viewers remember. The texture is what some viewers miss. A return to the show in 2025, with the announcement and production of a continuation, has put the question of the trade into a new context. The continuation, depending on how it handles the question of texture versus ambition, will either revive an aspect of the early mode or extend the late mode. The choice is a creative choice, and the choice will be visible in the work. There is no neutral position. To make new Gumball is to choose what Gumball is, and the choice will reveal itself in the first few episodes. This is one of the reasons the early to late inventory matters. It is not nostalgia. It is not a hierarchy. It is a clarification of what the show was at different moments, so that viewers and creators alike can see what has been gained and lost, and can see, when new work appears, what it is choosing to be. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Move now to a more granular comparison of specific scenes, because the abstractions are clearer when grounded in particulars. Consider the scene in the DVD where Gumball and Darwin enter the video rental store to return the damaged disc. The scene runs about 1.5 minutes. The store is photographed. The shelves are real shelves, dressed with fake DVDs, whose covers are visible in the background. The clerk behind the counter is a single character, drawn in the show's standard vector style. Gumball and Darwin approach the counter. The clerk asks if they need anything. Gumball stalls. Darwin freezes. The conversation proceeds at the speed of an actual conversation between 2 children and an adult. The texture of the scene is in the speed. Now consider the scene in The Inquisition, where the inspector reduces a student to a sketch outline. The scene runs about 10 seconds. The student is one of the supporting cast. The reduction happens in a single visual flourish. The scene's texture is not in the speed of the conversation, but in the visual punch of the transformation. There is no conversation. There is the punishment. The punishment is the scene. Both scenes are excellent. They are excellent in different ways. The first is excellent because the conversation is allowed to proceed. The second is excellent because the visual punch is allowed to land. The first depends on a show that holds. The second depends on a show that drives. The trade is the trade. Consider the scene in The Quest, where Aeneas confronts Tina Rex in the wasteland. The scene runs about 2 minutes. The wasteland is a treated photograph of an actual landscape, dressed with cartoon detritus. Aeneas, a small pink rabbit, faces Tina Rex, a much larger T-Rex. The confrontation is a verbal one. Aeneas demands her stuffed rabbit back. Tina Rex laughs. Aeneas holds her ground. The scene is allowed to play out at the rhythm of the confrontation, with Tina Rex's intimidation and Aeneas' resolve given equal time on screen. Now consider the scene in The Disaster, where Rob first uses the remote control to rewind a moment. The scene runs about 30 seconds. Rob clicks the remote. Reality rewinds. The visual sequence is rapid and disorienting. The scene's purpose is to introduce the remote control's capacity. There is no extended confrontation. There is the introduction. The introduction is the scene. Both scenes work. They work in different modes. The first works because the confrontation is allowed to develop. The second works because the introduction is allowed to be sudden. The early show specialized in development. The late show specialized in suddenness. Both modes are valid. Consider the scene, in the painting, where Richard and Gumball sit together at the end of the episode. The scene runs about a minute. Richard has accidentally damaged a piece of art that was important to Nicole. Gumball has helped him try to fix it. The fix has not worked. The two of them sit on the couch. They do not say much. They share a look. The look is the scene. The look is also the entire emotional point of the episode, expressed in the smallest possible gesture. Now, consider the scene, in the choices, where Nicole reaches the end of her counterfactual sequence and returns to her actual life. The scene runs about a minute. Nicole has imagined the lives she did not live. She has experienced, in compressed form, the alternates. She returns to the actual. The return is rendered with emotional directness. There is dialogue. There is music. There is a swell. The swell is the scene. The swell is also the emotional point of the episode, expressed in the largest possible gesture. Both scenes work. They work in different modes. The first works because the gesture is small. The second works because the gesture is large. The early show specialized in smallness. The late show specialized in largeness. Both modes are valid. These three pairings, the conversation versus the punishment, the confrontation versus the introduction, the small look versus the large swell, are not exhaustive. They are samples. They are samples of the trade as it expresses itself at the scene level. The early show held. The late show drove. The holding produced one kind of work. The driving produced another. Both kinds of work are real. Neither is a decline. Move now to the question of how the early texture was experienced by audiences at the time, because the historical reception is part of the inventory. When The Amazing World of Gumball premiered in May 2011, it was received as a strange and distinctive show. Reviews of the early episodes commented on the visual style. The mixing of media was treated as the show's primary novelty. Critics pointed to the photographic backgrounds and the vector characters as the most visible feature, and the feature was praised for its boldness. The show was seen as part of a larger wave of Cartoon Network programming that was experimenting with form. Adventure Time had premiered in 2010. Regular Show had premiered in 2010. Gumball, arriving in 2011, was understood as part of the same generation of network experimentation. Within that wave, Gumball occupied a specific position. It was not the surreal, mythological epic of Adventure Time. It was not the slacker sitcom of Regular Show. It was the photographic background show with the family setting and the small premises. The position was its own. The position was understood at the time as a position. The position was the early show. By the 5th and 6th seasons, the position had shifted. The show was no longer being received primarily for its photographic background novelty. It was being received for its formal ambition, its metafictional moves, its narrative daring. The reception had changed because the show had changed. The reception was not wrong. It was responding to a different show. The show that critics were responding to in 2018 and 2019 was a show that had spent 8 years building the capacity to do what the late seasons were doing. The reception was warranted, but there is a smaller reception, less visible in the trade press, but visible in fan communities, of viewers who had loved the early texture and who watched the late show with some ambivalence. These viewers were not wrong either. They were responding to the loss of a specific quality, and the loss was real, and naming the loss is part of the careful inventory the show deserves. Move now to a brief examination of the secondary characters who registered the trade most clearly. Sarah G. Lotto, the obsessive fangirl character, was introduced in the 3rd season as a single episode focus, and was deployed as a recurring background figure thereafter. Her early use was relatively restrained. By the late seasons, she had become a vehicle for the show's metafictional turn, with episodes that used her obsession as a stand-in for fan obsession with the show itself. The deployment was funny. The early restraint was a different mode. Rob, the Cyclops antagonist, was introduced as a background character early in the run and developed into the primary recurring villain by the 3rd season. The development was one of the most successful character arcs in the show. Rob is the late mode character. Rob is the figure who could not have existed in the 1st season's frame because the 1st season had no use for a recurring antagonist with a metaphysical grievance. The third season's disaster makes Rob what he becomes. The fifth and sixth seasons deploy him further. Mr. Small, Principal Brown, Coach Russo, Miss Simeon. The school's adult cast was established in the first season as a quartet of teacher figures with distinct registers. Mr. Small was the New Age counselor. Principal Brown was the bureaucrat. Coach Russo was the gym coach. Miss Simeon was the strict teacher. Across the run, these four held their registers more consistently than most of the other characters, and they functioned as a stabilizing element in the show's later, more chaotic mode. Their consistency was a kind of compensation for the loss of texture elsewhere. They preserved a residue of the early register inside the late environment. The Robinsons, Gumball's neighbors, shifted across the run in interesting ways. Mr. Robinson, the children's television host who lives next door, was initially a one-off comic figure. Episodes like The Robinson in the second season developed him into a more sympathetic character, and his presence in later seasons shifted from antagonist to grumbling but tolerated neighbor. The Robinson is one of the early to late threshold episodes, in that it gives a one-off character a richer interior life than the early frame would have hosted. Its softening of Mr. Robinson is part of the early trade, even though it occurs in the second season. Larry Needlemeyer, the everyman who works at every store and counter in Elmore, is one of the show's most quietly successful textual creations. He appears in the early seasons as a face behind various counters. He is the same person at every job. The repetition is the joke. The repetition is also the texture. By the later seasons, Larry has been given more focus, with episodes that explore his interior frustration at being underemployed across so many jobs. The development was earned. The early use, as a recurring face whose presence the audience accumulates without remarking, was a different kind of pleasure. Move now to a discussion of the show's writing room, because the writing side context informs the trade. The early seasons of Gumball were written by a small team that included Bacalé himself and a rotating set of writers who developed the show's voice. The voice that emerges from those early seasons is consistent enough to feel like a single hand, even though multiple hands wrote it. The consistency is one of the markers of the early texture. The voice has a calm. The voice has a slight English language sensibility, reflecting the show's European production. The voice has a specific feel for the small moment. By the later seasons, the writing room had grown. The voice had expanded to accommodate more contributors. The expansion produced a richer set of episode types, but a less unified voice. This is not a flaw. It is what happens when a show grows. The expansion produced episodes that the early voice could not have produced. It also dispersed the early voice across a larger set of contributing voices, and the dispersal is part of the texture loss. The trade, again, is real. A unified voice has its own virtue. A diverse set of voices has its own virtue. They are not the same virtue. The early show had the first. The late show had the second. The show as a whole had both in sequence. Specific writers and storyboard artists associated with the show across its run included Mike Graves, James Lamont, John Foster, and others. Their individual contributions are difficult to disentangle from the collective output, but their presence on the show shaped the voice in ways that accumulate across episodes. The crediting is not part of the texture argument as such, but the human reality of the show's making is worth acknowledging. People made these episodes. The people changed across the run. The texture changed with the people. Move now to a smaller observation about the show's sense of place. There is a quality the early seasons of Gumball had, which is a feel for the specific time of day in which a scene is set. The first season's episodes have scenes that read as morning, midday, afternoon, evening, night, with the lighting of the photographic backgrounds reflecting the time. The Wattersons' kitchen at breakfast looks different from the Wattersons' kitchen at dinner. The school hallways at the start of the day look different from the school hallways at the end. The lighting is part of the texture. By the later seasons, the lighting has become more uniform, partly because the digital treatment of backgrounds has standardized the look, and partly because the increased structural metabolism of the late episodes leaves less room for time of day to register. Episodes proceed at the speed of their premise, and the lighting is calibrated to the premise rather than to the diurnal cycle. The shift is small. It is part of the broader pattern. A specific example. In the DVD, the opening scene takes place in the Wattersons' living room in what reads as morning, with light coming through the windows at a specific angle. The scene at the video rental store takes place in what reads as midday, with the store's interior lighting making the time of day legible. The scene at the end of the episode takes place in what reads as evening, with the warmer color register suggesting late afternoon. The 11 minutes of the episode have moved through a day. By the late seasons, episodes more often take place in a single time of day register, with the lighting unchanging across the runtime. This is, in some sense, a small observation. It is also one of the textures that, accumulated across an entire season, produced the early show's feeling of inhabiting a real place. A place has time. A place has light that changes. A show that registers the change is registering its setting as a real setting. A show that does not is operating in a more abstract space. Move now to a synthesis of the supporting observations. The qualities the early show had, the photographic backgrounds, the held silences, the small premises, the unnarrowed characters, the soft household, the location as location school, the dual thread rhythm, the fixed visual register, the diegetic music, the small textural moments, the original child voice cast, the Bacalé-led showrunning, the muted color palette, the time of day lighting, the unified writing voice, together constituted the early texture. The texture is what made the early show feel the way it felt. The feeling is what the trade cost. The qualities the late show developed. The metafictional ambition, the visual permeability, the existential premises, the hardened characters, the metaphorical school, the single-thread rhythm, the multi-medium playground, the structural music, the formal experiment, the recast voice cast, the collective showrunning, the saturated color palette, the uniform lighting, the diversified writing voice, together constituted the late ambition. The ambition is what made the late show feel the way it felt. The feeling is what the trade produced. These are two different feelings. They belong to two different modes of the same show. The trade between them was not a decline. The trade was a transformation, and the transformation produced peaks at both ends. Early peaks of texture, late peaks of ambition, with a long middle stretch in which the transformation was happening, and the show was operating in both modes simultaneously. The middle stretch, broadly the third and fourth seasons, is in some ways the most interesting period of the show, because it is where the trade is most visible in motion. The disaster is in the third season. The choices is in the third season. These are early episodes for the late mode. The painting is in the first season. The refund is in the first season. These are late episodes for the early mode, in the sense that they appeared as the show was beginning to discover what it could do. The middle stretch contains both modes. The middle stretch is where the texture and the ambition coexist most clearly. This is the last note in the inventory. The trade is not a single line in the sand. The trade is a long gradient, across which the show moved at varying speeds, with episodes from each mode appearing throughout the run. The early texture lasted longer than the first season. The late ambition began earlier than the sixth. The cumulative shape is what the inventory has been describing, and the cumulative shape is best appreciated by watching the run in order, with attention to the texture at the start and the ambition at the end. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Move now to a final extended treatment of the comparison, because the topic deserves one last sustained pass. The amazing world of Gumball, considered as a whole, is one of the more ambitious projects in the history of children's television animation. The combination of photographic backgrounds and animated characters had been done before in scattered productions, but never sustained at the scale of a network series. The decision to commit to that combination across more than 200 episodes was, in its quiet way, a structural commitment of considerable difficulty. Every episode required a location to be photographed or treated. Every shot required a composite of media. Every character required a specific visual register that could be matched to the photographed environment without breaking either side of the equation. The early seasons did this work in its purest form. The photographic backgrounds were unmistakably photographic. The characters were unmistakably drawings. The seam between them was the show's primary visual signature. The signature was earned, episode by episode, through the discipline of holding the registers fixed. The later seasons inherited the signature and used it as a starting point rather than as a destination. The seam was still there. The seam was now one of several visual moves. The other moves, the multimedium experiments, the style switches, the metafictional disruptions, accumulated alongside the seam. The seam was no longer the show. The seam was part of the show. This is the cleanest version of the trade. The signature in the early seasons was the show. The signature in the later seasons was part of the show. Part of the show is not less valuable than show itself. They are different positions. The early position had a coherence. The late position had a range. The coherence was traded for the range. The range produced peaks that the coherence could not have produced. The coherence had its own peaks that the range could not preserve. The two modes can be experienced today by watching specific episodes back to back. Watch The Painting, the 17th episode of the first season, and then watch The Choices, the 27th episode of the third season. 2 episodes about parents and the constraints of household life. The Painting is small. The Choices is large. Both are excellent. The Painting could not have been The Choices. The Choices could not have been The Painting. They are the same show, and they are different shows. Watch the DVD, the second segment of the first episode, and then watch The Inquisition, the 44th episode of the 6th season. 2 episodes about the negotiation of authority figures with the show's central pair. The DVD is small. The Inquisition is large. Both are excellent. The DVD could not have been The Inquisition. The Inquisition could not have been the DVD. They are the same show, and they are different shows. Watch The Quest, the 3rd episode of the first season, and then watch The Disaster, the 26th episode of the 3rd season. 2 episodes about a confrontation with an antagonist. The Quest is small. The Disaster is large. Both are excellent. The Quest could not have been The Disaster. The Disaster could not have been The Quest. They are the same show, and they are different shows. These pairings could continue. The pressure with the choices. The mystery with the stories. The refund with the worst. Each pairing reveals a different facet of the trade. The early episodes are smaller, slower, more textured. The late episodes are larger, faster, more ambitious. The smallness, the slowness, the texture. These are the qualities the late peaks did not preserve. They are the qualities the early seasons were built on. The inventory can finally rest. The early show had a quality that the late show traded for ambition. The trade produced peaks. The trade also lost the quality. The quality was specific. The quality was the texture of a show that held its moments, that respected its locations, that let its characters be unhurried, that committed to its registers, that trusted its silences. That quality is what early Gumball had. That quality is what was traded. It is fair to say, finally, that early Gumball is better than late Gumball in one specific sense. The sense in which a textural show is better than an ambitious show, and that late Gumball is better than early Gumball in another specific sense. The sense in which an ambitious show is better than a textural show. Both senses are real. The ranking depends on which virtue the viewer prizes. A viewer who prizes texture will rank the early seasons higher. A viewer who prizes ambition will rank the late seasons higher. Most viewers prize both in different proportions, and most viewers will find that their ranking shifts depending on which virtue they are thinking about at the moment. The inventory has tried to honor both virtues. It has named the texture and the ambition. It has not pretended that one is automatically higher than the other. It has argued only that the texture was traded, that the trade was real, and that what was lost was specific enough to deserve a careful description. Picture, finally, 2 shots from the show, one from the first season and one from the 6th. The first shot is from the DVD. Gumball stands at the door of the video rental store, holding the damaged DVD in his hand. The store behind him is a real store. The light is the light of an actual midday. He is small in the frame. He hesitates before going in. The hesitation is held for 2 beats. Then he opens the door. The bell above the door jingles. He walks in. The shot is unremarkable in any way that a marketing department would notice. The shot is the show. The second shot is from the Inquisition. Gumball stands in the school hallway, surrounded by the inspector's pursuit, his classmates being reduced to sketches around him. The hallway behind him is no longer a real hallway. It is a hallway under existential threat. The light is the light of a metafictional crisis. He is large in the frame. He does not hesitate. He acts. The act is captured in a sequence of rapid style shifts. The shot is dazzling in any way a marketing department would notice. The shot is also the show. Both shots are the same character in the same school, 8 years apart. The character is recognizable in both. The school is recognizable in both. The texture of each shot is utterly different. The first shot is what early Gumball was. The second shot is what late Gumball became. Both are real. Both are excellent. They are not the same shot. Move now to a more careful walk through the show's first season as a single object, because the first season is the purest expression of the early texture and deserves to be considered as a whole. The first season ran from May 3rd, 2011 to March 13th, 2012. It contains 36 segments, paired into 18 episodes. The premiere episode, the DVD paired with the responsible, sets the show's parameters in less than 23 minutes. The DVD establishes the photographic backgrounds, the dual-thread family structure, the patient pacing. The responsible establishes Nicole's parental register, the stress, the warmth underneath the stress. By the end of the first paired episode, the show's voice is fully visible. There is no extended ramp-up. The voice is there from the first segment. The third, paired with the debt, follows in the second episode and develops the school as a location. The quest, paired with the spoon, gives the show its first real venture beyond Elmore proper. The pressure, paired with the painting, establishes the romantic and family stakes that will accumulate across the season. By the time the season reaches its midpoint, the show has built a working version of every register it will operate in for the next 2 years. The second half of the first season pushes those registers further. The goons, the mystery, the prank, the date, the club, the wand, the ghost. The Watterson family is now established enough that any of these episodes can pull from any of the established registers without reintroducing them. The patience the show has built up in the first half pays off in the second half. The audience knows the family. The audience knows the school. The audience knows the rules. The episodes can play with those rules. The Date, the 22nd episode of the first season, is one of the quieter episodes in the run. It follows Darwin asking Carrie out on a first date. The premise is small. The execution is gentle. The episode runs entirely on the texture of two characters trying to navigate an awkward situation, with neither of them fully equipped for it. There is no escalation. There is no metafictional turn. There is no high-concept twist. There is the date. The date is the episode. The episode is the show. The Wand, the 24th episode of the first season, follows Aeneas wanting a wand from a magic shop. The premise is small. The wand turns out to be more than a toy. The episode handles the more than a toy revelation with restraint, refusing to escalate into the kind of metaphysical crisis the late seasons would have made of the same setup. The wand has a power. The power produces a small problem. The small problem is resolved. The resolution returns the family to its baseline. The baseline is the show. These two episodes, The Date and the Wand, are not the most cited episodes of the first season. They are the texture. Again, they are what the first season was, when it was being itself most fully. Move now to a similar walk through the second season, because the second season is where the show begins to test what it can do. The second season ran from October 3rd, 2011 to October 11th, 2012, and contains 40 segments, paired into 20 episodes. The Robinson, the second season's late introduction of Mr. Robinson as a sympathetic figure, is one of the season's clearest expansion moments. Mr. Robinson, who had appeared in the first season as an antagonistic neighbor, is given an interior life in the Robinson. The episode follows Gumball trying to befriend him, and the befriending reveals Mr. Robinson to be a more sympathetic figure than the first season had suggested. The expansion is small. It is also part of the early to late trade. A first season episode would not have given Mr. Robinson this much interiority. The Sweaters, in the same season, is another expansion moment. The episode follows Gumball and Darwin going through a phase of conformity, and the conformity is treated with a mix of affection and critique. The treatment requires a level of social awareness the first season had only hinted at. The Sweaters does the social awareness explicitly. It is the show beginning to articulate its own perspective on the world, rather than simply rendering the world. The Pony, the 7th episode of the second season, is one of the season's textural standouts. Aeneas wants a pony, the cartoon pony, and the wanting is treated as a real desire. The episode does not undermine her wanting with cynicism. It treats the want as a child's want, and it follows the want to its consequences. The treatment is gentle. The gentleness is the texture. The Ghost, the second season episode that introduces Carrie, is the show's first extended deployment of a non-vector character at the center of an episode. The deployment is restrained. Carrie's painterly visual register is honored throughout. The show does not switch styles to comment on her difference. The show treats her difference as a fixed property of who she is, and the comedy emerges from the property without the property being overdrawn. The Words in the second season is a small textural piece about Gumball saying the wrong thing and being unable to take it back. The premise is domestic. The execution is patient. The episode is one of many in the second season that could have been an early first season episode, and it sits comfortably alongside the painting and the refund as a texture piece. The second season also contains episodes that begin to push beyond the early texture. The Bumpkin and the Flower, with their broader tonal range, are early indications of where the show will go. The Curse, near the end of the season, leans into a more high-concept register than the first season would have. These are not flaws. They are the show testing what else it can be. Move now to the third season, the season in which the trade becomes most visible in motion. The third season ran from August 21st, 2014 to October 1st, 2015, and contains 44 segments, paired into 22 episodes. The Joy, the 11th episode of the third season, is sometimes cited as the unsettling threshold piece, an episode that pushes the show's tonal range further than anything in the first two seasons had done. The Joy treats joy as a contagious infection that spreads through the school, and the rendering of the infection is closer to body horror than to standard family comedy fare. The episode is funny. The episode is also genuinely uneasy. The unease is part of the third season's signature. The Disaster, the 26th episode of the third season, is the visual threshold episode. As discussed, Rob acquires the reality editing remote control, and the episode visualizes the remote control's effects through animation-style switches. The Disaster is one of the most ambitious episodes in the run, and it is the moment the late mode is born. After the Disaster, the show has access to a kind of formal play it did not previously deploy. After the Disaster, the show is the Late Show, even though there are still 3 seasons to go. The Choices, the 27th episode of the third season, is the emotional threshold episode. As discussed, the episode follows Nicole through her counterfactual alternates, and the rendering of the alternates is sustained throughout. The Choices is the moment the show demonstrates that it can hold an emotional register across an entire episode without breaking for jokes. After The Choices, the show has access to a kind of emotional directness it did not previously deploy. These 2 episodes, The Disaster and The Choices, are paired in the third season's late stretch. They are not consecutive in air date. They are consecutive in episode number, separated by a brief production gap. They function as a 1-2 punch that announces what the show is becoming. After them, the show is no longer the small premise family comedy of the first season. It is something else. The something else is what the late seasons will be. The third season also contains, alongside these threshold episodes that operate in the early register. The Money, the 17th episode, is a small textural piece about the family running out of money. The Hero, the 20th episode, is a small piece about Richard becoming a folk hero in the family's eyes. These episodes coexist with the threshold pieces, and the coexistence is part of what makes the third season the most interesting season in the run. Both modes are present. Both modes are operating. Move now to the fourth season, which is in some ways the show's transitional season. The season in which the late mode begins to dominate, without the early mode having fully receded. The fourth season ran from September 17th, 2015 to August 4th, 2016, and contains 40 segments, paired into 20 episodes. The Shell, the third episode of the fourth season, is the season's clearest expansion moment for a returning character. As discussed, Penny breaks her shell and becomes a shape-shifting being. The episode is excellent. The expansion is consequential. After The Shell, Penny is a different character. The difference produces strong material across the next 2 seasons. The difference also costs the early peanut. The Fury in the fourth season deepens Mr. Small in ways the early seasons had not. The Heart in the fourth season deepens Carrie's relationship with Darwin in ways that would have been impossible at her introduction. The Catfish in the fourth season gives an extended treatment to the relationship between Richard and his estranged father, and the treatment is more emotionally direct than the first season would have hosted. These episodes are good. They are also evidence of the trade in motion. The fourth season is when the show's expansion of its emotional register becomes routine rather than threshold. By the end of the fourth season, the audience expects the show to be capable of this kind of register shift. The expectation is part of what shapes the late mode. The expectation is what the early mode did not yet have to manage. The fourth season is also the last season with Logan Grove as Gumball. The recasting that follows is a structural structural event in the show's history, and it sits at the seam between the show's middle period and its late period. After the 4th season, the voice changes. After the voice changes, the show is recognizably itself, but the specific texture of the early voice is gone. Move now to the 5th season, which is the first season of the show's late mode in its fullest expression. The 5th season ran from October 18th, 2016 to October 18th, 2018, and contains 44 segments, paired into 22 episodes. The Test, the 3rd episode of the 5th season, is one of the season's clearest deployments of the late mode's metafictional capacity. The episode treats the characters as figures whose personalities can be quantified and explained. And the treatment is funny because the show by now has built characters complex enough to resist the quantification. The metafictional turn lands because the characters have texture to push against. The Vase, in the 5th season, is a small piece about Gumball's grandmother visiting and the family's attempt to handle her presence with grace. The episode is a return of sorts to the early texture, with a domestic premise and a patient execution. The 5th season has several of these returns. They are not the season's dominant mode. They are evidence that the show could still operate in the early mode when it chose to. The Singing, the 15th episode of the 5th season, is the show's most extended deployment of the musical register that the early seasons had used so sparingly. The episode features sustained song cues across its 11 minutes. The cues are well deployed. They are also a feature of the late mode that the early mode would not have used in this concentration. The Ollie, the 17th episode, deepens Penny's family in ways that build on the shell. The X, the 20th episode, gives Mr. Robinson another extended treatment, building on the Robinson from the 2nd season. The 5th season is, in many ways, a season of deepening, with episodes that take the structural and emotional work of the 3rd and 4th seasons and push it further. The 5th season is also the last season with Bacalé in active showrunning. The transition that follows is not a sudden break. The 6th season is recognizably the same show, but the dominant sensibility shifts, and the shift is part of the late mode reaching its peak. Move now to the 6th season, the show's final season, and the season in which the late mode produces its most ambitious work. The 6th season ran from November 5th, 2018 to June 24th, 2019, and contains 44 segments, paired into 22 episodes. The Inquisition, as discussed, is the season's most cited episode, and one of the show's most ambitious. The Saint, The Stories, The Worst, The List, The One, all of these are season 6 episodes that demonstrate the show at its late peak. The season also contains quieter pieces, like The Faith and the Candidate, that show the late mode's ability to handle smaller registers as well. The 6th season is shorter, in some ways denser, and ends decisively. There is no question, watching the season as a whole, that the show is going out at a high point. The final stretch of episodes is among the most ambitious sequence of episodes in the show's run. The going out at a peak is rare for animated comedies. Gumball managed it. The going out is also, in another sense, the cost of the trade. The show ended at a peak in its late mode. The late mode is what the show became after trading the early texture. The peak is what the trade produced. The texture is what the trade cost. Both ledger entries are real. The show, considered as a whole, is the sum of both. Move now to a slightly different angle, which is the question of what an audience watching the show today should expect from each season. A new viewer, starting with the 1st season today, should expect a slow show, a patient show, a show that holds its moments, a show that does not hurry, a show whose visual signature is the seam between photographed backgrounds and animated characters, and a show that lets the seam be the show. The 1st season is small in scope and large in texture. It rewards attention to its small moments. A viewer continuing into the 2nd season should expect the show to be testing its capacities. New characters, new registers, slight expansions of the original frame. The 2nd season is the season of consolidation, in which the show learns what it can do beyond its initial parameters. A viewer reaching the 3rd season should expect the show to begin pushing into new modes. The joy, the disaster, the choices, all in the 3rd season, signal what the show is becoming. The 3rd season is is the season of motion, in which the trade becomes visible at the level of individual episodes. A viewer in the 4th season should expect the late mode to be more dominant. The shell, the heart, the catfish, the season is full of expansion moments. The early texture is still present in scattered episodes, but it is no longer the dominant mode. A viewer in the 5th season should expect the late mode in its fullness. The metafictional capacity, the emotional directness, the formal play, all of these are routine by now. The original child voice cast is being replaced. The show sounds different. A viewer in the 6th season should expect the late mode at its peak. The Inquisition, the Saint, the stories, the worst, all are 6th season works. The show is going out at its highest ambition. This trajectory is not unique to Gumball. Many long-running animated comedies follow a similar shape. What is unique to Gumball is the specific quality of the early texture, which was so unlike anything else on television that its loss feels specifically like a loss rather than like a generic shift. The trade is named, again, as a trade between texture and ambition. The trade is real. The texture and the ambition are both real. Neither cancels the other. Move now to a closing meditation on what watching all of this means for someone returning to the show now. A viewer who watched Gumball as a child in 2011 and 2012 has a specific memory of the early texture. The memory is shaped by what the show was at the time and by what the viewer was at the time. A viewer returning to the show in 2025 brings the memory and meets the show as it now is. Available in its full 6-season run. Available also in the form of the announced continuation. The encounter between memory and present tense work is the place where the trade is felt most directly. The early episodes will feel slower than they did, or they will feel exactly as slow as they did, which is to say, slow in a way that the late episodes are not. The slowness is no longer a default mode of children's animation. The slowness is a specific aesthetic choice. The recognition of the choice is part of what watching the early seasons today produces. The early seasons are, in some sense, more clearly themselves now than they were when they aired, because the contrast with the rest of children's animation has sharpened. The late episodes will feel as ambitious as they ever did, or they will feel more ambitious, because the years between their airing and now have made their formal moves more recognizable. The Inquisition, watched in 2025, is a remarkable piece of work that shows its hand more clearly than it did in 2019. The Choices, watched in 2025, is an emotionally direct piece that resonates differently for an older audience. The late episodes age into themselves. The trade between the two modes, watched across the full run, becomes visible as a trade rather than as a decline. The early viewer often experiences the late mode as a loss because the early mode is what they fell in love with. The late viewer often experiences the early mode as a beginning because the late mode is what the show became. Both perspectives are true. The show is what it is in both modes. The trade is the trade. Move now to one further extended observation about what the early texture taught its audience. There is a specific kind of attention that the early seasons of Gumball asked of their audience. The attention was patience. The attention was the willingness to sit with a small premise and let it develop. The attention was the willingness to register a held silence as part of the joke and to register a fixed visual register as part of the world. The early show trained its audience in this attention, episode by episode, across its first 3 seasons. The training was not announced. It was implicit in the way the show was made. The audience that emerged from the first 3 seasons was an audience capable of this attention. The audience could watch a small premise and find it sufficient. The audience could watch a held silence and not feel impatient. The audience could watch a fixed visual register and not feel that the show was being repetitive. This was the audience the show had built, and this audience was the audience the show served when it operated in its early mode. The late show served a different audience. The late audience expected formal ambition. The late audience expected emotional directness. The late audience expected the show to push, to risk, to escalate. The late show trained its audience in these expectations, episode by episode, across its 3rd through 6th seasons. The training, again, was implicit. It was in the way the show was made. These two audiences are not separate populations. They are the same audience at different points in the show's run. The audience that watched the first season in 2011 is the audience that watched The Inquisition in 2019. Broadly, the audience grew with the show. The growth is part of why the trade was possible. An audience that had only seen the first season would have struggled with The Inquisition. An audience that had seen the full run was prepared for it. This is one of the underappreciated achievements of Gumball as a project. It built an audience capable of moving with it. The audience that the show ended with was not the audience that the show began with. The audience had been transformed alongside the show. The transformation is part of what made the late peaks possible. The transformation is also why the early texture is harder to feel today, because the audience that prized the early texture has, in many cases, internalized the late expectations and finds the early texture a little quaint, a little slow, a little less than what the show eventually became. The early texture is not less than. It is different from. The difference is what the inventory has been describing. Move now to a closing image, before the final restatement. The Wattersons' kitchen, in the first season of The Amazing World of Gumball, has a specific quality of light. The kitchen is photographed. It is a real kitchen, dressed for the show. The light comes through the windows at the angle of an actual morning. The cabinets are wood. The counter is a counter. The refrigerator hums faintly in the background, in the sound mix, the way an actual refrigerator hums. Around the table sit the family. Nicole is reading the paper. Richard is eating a bowl of cereal. Aeneas is doing homework. Gumball and Darwin are arguing about something that is not important. The conversation is low. The light is the morning light. Nothing is happening. This is the early texture. This is what the early show looked like. Scene after scene, episode after episode. Nothing was happening, and the nothing was the show. The household was a household. The morning was a morning. The texture was the show. The same kitchen in the 6th season looks different. The kitchen is still photographed. The light is still light. But the kitchen is now more often a stage for the comic crisis of the day. Nicole is more often in motion. Richard is more often in pursuit of food. Aeneas is more often delivering the deadpan. Gumball and Darwin are more often the engines of the episode's premise. The household is still recognizably a household. The household is also a vehicle. The vehicle moves the show forward. The forward motion is the late mode. Both kitchens are the same kitchen. The 8 years between them have changed what the kitchen is for. The kitchen as a place to eat breakfast in. The kitchen as a stage for the day's premise. Both are real. Both are excellent. They are not the same kitchen. This is the final note before the closing. The early Gumball had a quality. The late Gumball traded for ambition. The trade was real. The trade produced peaks. The trade also lost the quality. The quality is worth naming. The naming is what the inventory has been doing. There is one further thread worth pulling on before the final image, and it concerns the nature of the trade itself as a creative act rather than as a passive drift. The early texture was not maintained by accident. It was held in place by 1,000 small decisions. The decision to use a photographic background rather than a painted one. The decision to hold a beat of silence rather than fill it with a gag. The decision to keep a character at one visual register rather than switch registers for emphasis. The decision to write a small premise rather than a large one. Each decision was small. The accumulation of the decisions was the texture. The texture was the result of the discipline of the decisions. The late ambition was also not arrived at by accident. It was earned by 1,000 decisions of a different kind. The decision to test a new style mid-shot. The decision to write a metafictional scene. The decision to pursue an emotional register across an entire episode. The decision to give a recurring character an extended arc. Each decision was small. The accumulation of these decisions was the ambition. The ambition was the result of the willingness to make these decisions. Between the early discipline and the late willingness sits the trade. The discipline produced one kind of show. The willingness produced another. Neither kind of show was easy. Both required sustained creative effort across multiple seasons. The decision to hold a beat is not an absence of effort. The decision to switch styles is not the only effort. Both are effort, expressed in different directions. This is part of why the inventory matters. It refuses the easy reading of the trade as discipline versus laziness, or as simplicity versus overreach. The trade is not a moral category. It is an aesthetic one. The early discipline and the late willingness are both modes of creative work. They produce different results. The results are both real. The trade is the choice between them. Move now to one final granular comparison before the closing image returns. In the first season's The Spoon, there is a scene of the Watterson family at dinner with the visiting relative. The scene runs about 90 seconds. The relative is talking about something dull. The family is listening, more or less, with various levels of engagement. The camera moves from face to face, registering each character's reaction without commentary. The scene is funny because the family's polite distress is honest. The scene is also unremarkable in any structural sense. It is a dinner scene. The show treats it as a dinner scene. In the 6th season's The Inquisition, there is a scene of the entire student body of Elmore Junior High mobilizing against the inspector. The scene runs about 90 seconds. Characters from across the show's run appear in the frame, each rendered in their visual register. Banana Joe is a banana. Tobias is a rainbow. Carrie is a ghost. Bobert is a robot. Penny is in her shape-shifting form. The scene is funny because the entire ensemble has been assembled. The scene is also remarkable in every structural sense. It is a culmination. The show treats it as a culmination. Both 90-second scenes are excellent. The first is excellent because it treats a dinner as a dinner. The second is excellent because it treats a culmination as a culmination. The first works because the show held the registers of its supporting characters fixed enough that the dinner could be a dinner. The second works because the show built the ensemble across 8 years until it could be assembled in a single shot. Each of these scenes depends on the other. The dinner scene was the early discipline that built the characters whose ensemble the late ambition could assemble. The culmination scene was the late ambition that earned the right to call upon the discipline. The two scenes are not in conflict. They are in conversation. The conversation is the show. This is what the inventory has been describing: the conversation between the two modes, the trade between them, the way each mode depended on the other while costing something specific to it. The early Gumball was textural. The late Gumball was ambitious. The trade between them was real. The peaks of the late mode are remarkable, and the texture of the early mode is irreplaceable. Both are part of the same body of work. The work is what it is, not because one mode won, but because the show moved through both modes with discipline and willingness in turn. Picture, one more time, the two shots that opened and closed the inventory. Gumball at the door of the video rental store, holding a damaged DVD, hesitating before going in. Gumball in the school hallway, surrounded by the inspector's pursuit, acting without hesitation. Both Gumballs are the same character. Both shots are the same show. The character changed because the show changed. The show changed because the trade was made. The trade was the trade. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next.